of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And thank you. That's especially meaningful, I think, on the day of September the 11th, which has kind of been obscured by the hurricane, but hope you'll take some time and remember all those people in the path of the hurricane, as well as the folks who were involved in September the 11th, which was 17 years ago, I believe, 16 years ago. Yeah. Okay, Bill Ring is going to introduce our good program this morning. Bill, listen.
Well, Alex said to me I needed to speak loud because we had people here that were aged and needed something, and I told Alex I wore both my hearing aids today, so that at 79 I could be a part of the crowd. Let me say how much I appreciate, well, I think I appreciate Ring talking me into this. And it's fitting, today is September 11th. In 7 months, it will be 55 years since the Kingsport Press Strike started. And most people in this town don't know a darn thing about the Kingsport Press Strike. And what most of them know about the Kingsport Press is across the way, where the tower sits in the supermarket parking lot. It's been a long time. Let me say this. The Kingsport Press at one point had, at the time of the strike, had 2,200 employees. At that point, the strikers, 5 unions, had contracts with the Kingsport Press. The 5 unions voted to strike, and they started their strike on March 11th, 1963. The unions that went out and strike were the Bindery Workers Union, the Electrotypers, no longer exist, the Machinists Union, which was one of the smallest, the Pressmen, which was the largest, about 300 people classified as pressmen in the plant, and the typographers, and that was the old ITU union. The ITU union no longer exists. The pressmen no longer exist. The machinists do. The electrotypers and the bindery workers are all merged into one or two unions that were a consolidation of a number of these other unions in the communications field. The printing industry has drastically changed. A 6th union was created after the strike commenced, when the pressmen organized some of the female workers, and what did they call them, Tommy?
The specialty union.
Yes, but
which was back in those days was the janitors and the maids, which is now the
janitors and maids. And so they became the 6th union to go out and strike. What was different about this, and let me suggest, I don't recommend this book, but it's the only book that's ever been written about the Kingsport Press Strike. Unfortunately, it was written by a man by the name of Sylvester Petro. Petro was a professor of law at NYU Law School in New York City. He was a professor and was writing on this book when I was at Columbia Graduate Law School in New York. And Petro was known as a terribly anti-union person and for all practical purposes, never really believed in the National Labor Relations Act or other matters. But it's the only book available that will tell you anything about the strike. All the bargaining for a new contract for the 5 and then 6 unions was done as a single unit, which was a distinction from prior years, where in the prior collective bargaining agreements, they had the pressman would negotiate with the press, the machinist would negotiate, the typographical, the bindery, etc. The unions decided they would not bargain in that way, but rather as a single unit, because it gave them more economic power and strength, which in fact it did. Got to keep in mind that the Kingsport Press was one of the biggest hardbound book publishers in the United States. It was a company of immense importance in the industry and a significant asset to the community. The president of the press was really founded by a man, E.W. Palmer. E.W. Palmer was president of it. He also, I might add, I have something in common with him, in that both he and I served as chairman of the Board of Trustees of Tusculum College. As a matter of fact, after World War II, Colonel Palmer, as he was named at that time, and you all may remember as you went into the country club, you'd go down the hallway, and to the right was the ballroom, and to the left was the Palmer room. And it had a photograph of Colonel Palmer in it. Colonel Palmer was a real leader in the book publishing industry. The president of the Pressmen's Union, the major union on strike, earlier was George L. Berry. And George L. Berry was a founder of the American Legion from World War I. He became, at the age of 24, president of this international union. And he moved its headquarters at a later date to Pressman's Home outside of Rogersville. And if you never went to Pressman's Home, it's too late. All that's left is the school. And the school is a very big, impressive building. It also had a hotel, the Prasanna Hotel. It had a chapel, which had hymnals for multiple denominations. It was originally created, both the ITU, the typographical workers, and the pressmen, in the turn of the century and up until the 30s. It was quite common for tuberculosis to develop in the printing industry, working in amongst the presses and what have you. And so both the ITU and the printing pressmen developed these hospitals, and where people could come who had tuberculosis and stay and get well. Many died there too. Anyway, that was, and it was a large complex that had a farm on it and the whole thing. Tommy and I had lunch in the Prasanna Hotel the last day it served lunch. And then it closed down and ultimately was some vandals in Hawkins County burned it down. George L. Berry, who was the president of the pressmen, while Palmer was president of the press, Berry also was a businessman. he owned, the union owned Citizens Union Bank in Rogersville. And it's the bank that was directly opposite the courthouse. Also, Major Berry, he had a military title. He was the owner, personal owner, of the International Playing Card and Label Company in Rogersville. And so you've had a president of the International Union in the printing industry who was also president of a large printing company that he owned. Berry was appointed United States Senator by Gordon Browning when a vacancy occurred from Tennessee at the request of President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt appointed Berry to the first National Labor Relations Board. Much conflict has arisen over why the press strike occurred. At the time, most people would, most adherents to the union would not acknowledge the fact that one of the major reasons for the strike was the fact that throughout the country there were maybe 20, 22 major printing industry people, companies. R.W. Donnelly in Chicago, and you had ones in one in Brattleboro, Vermont, and you had a number in New York. They were complaining about a situation that existed as a result of the close relationship of Colonel Palmer and Major Berry. And over the years, Major Berry and Colonel Palmer would just sort of, work out a contract between themselves for all the union workers. And then the other unions would follow suit, pretty much in the same thing. And so there were no strikes, there was no animosity. But what it resulted in was that the Kingsport Press had an economic advantage in that the strikers, the workers at the Kingsport Press were being paid less than what was the general trend in the printing industry, particularly the bookbinders. And so when a company would make a bid for the printing of a book, in many cases, the press got the contract because their price was less because they were paying their workers less. Now, prior to the beginning of the strike in '63, there were some significant changes in the leadership of the Kingsport Press. One of them was a man named Cliff Fritchley, who was the director of human relations. He had everything but his dissertation for his PhD. He had taught in the business school at the University of Tennessee. He had very strong feelings about unions. And many people will say that involved, and I was not involved in the strike. I didn't come to Kingsport till '67. But many people would say that Fritchley was part of the cause of the strike. Ed Treby was the president of the Kingsport Press. Ed Treby was well liked by the workers in the plant. He was liked and admired by the union members who went out on strike. It was always felt that if Ed Treby could have negotiated the contract, things would have been better. The major person for the union was a Kingsport lawyer by the name of John McClellan. And in his book, Petro describes McClellan as follows. As we shall see, at least one highly placed Union official, a man of great ability and experience, who was known and dealt with the press management for many years, and who was proven on countless occasions to be the press's most skillful opponent. This man, John S. McClellan, General Counsel of the International Printing Pressmen and Assistants Union of North America, has never used the press management as a punching bag. He's talking about the strike. He has opposed and continues to oppose the press. He has given the press management many an occasion an anxious hour, and maybe a great inroads in what otherwise would have been normal sleeping time. McClellan called the strike the press mess. Other people later on said it was a great mistake and the strike should never have occurred. McClellan negotiated for the 5 unions, along with a negotiating committee, including Tommy. The president of the Printing Pressmen's Union, the international president, was a man by the name of Anthony J. DeAndre. And he was originally from New England and had been an officer for many years in the Union. And when the opportunity arose, he was elected international president. I served for a number of years as general counsel to the United Textile Workers of America. And I represented them all over the United States and Canada until they merged with the United Food and Commercial Workers, and I still carried on. There are no more textile plants left in America, unfortunately. In my years as general counsel, I felt like I was a mortician, Tommy, because it just no longer existed. Kingsport at one point had McClellan and myself. I left McClellan in 69 as an associate. And we had, in this little town, 2 general counsels of AFL-CIO affiliate unions, which was unusual. They didn't have that many in Chicago. Walter Allen also participated in the negotiations. Walter Allen was director of research for the Printing Pressmen's Union, and he was based at Pressman's Home. Allen called the Berry-Colonel Palmer relationship a sweetheart relationship. In the negotiations, it kind of boiled down to a 3-year contract with wages being the primary division, and that the union wanted a 5%, 8%, 8% wage increase over a 3-year period. The company proposed no increase in the first year and 2 8% increases in subsequent years. The next thing that kept the strike going on was an aspect of American labor law. When they went out on strike at the press, the 1,900 people, they became economic strikers. Economic strikers in labor law, for all practical purposes, give up their job to go out and strike. And so when they saw people crossing the picket line from Southwest Virginia and other places to take jobs at the press, they saw their jobs going out the window. And it became a real problem. One of the unions, the Machinists Local, 1694, had only 44 members. 24 members participated in the strike vote, and of that, 20 of them were for the strike. Ultimately, the machinists were very poor compatriots of the other unions. DeAndre, the president of the International Printing Pressmen, said that in retrospect, that it was a, quote, senseless strike, close quote. Claude Smith, the president of the Pressmen's Local, said it was a big mistake. McClellan, the general counsel of the Printing Pressmen's Union, called it a press mess. One of the coolest things in the strike for labor lawyer people is the fact that when a contract expires, the union that has gone out, let's say, on strike, or they may still be working, that after 12 months, in that situation, they know at the end of 12 months, they are no longer the certified collective bargaining representative of the people on strike. One of the things McClellan did, which is perhaps unheard of, was he was able to get a vote for the unions on the 11th month and 30th day, with 1 day left to the unions losing their certification as the bargaining representative. Terribly important. He filed petitions. They had a hearing here. The hearing officer gave the company until like Sunday to have their brief in, and it was a 500-page transcript. They got the brief in, and on Monday the board held that there would be a strike. And that comes under Section 9A3 of the National Labor Relations Act. It was a masterful piece that McClellan did. I've known lawyers around the country. When I was general counsel, we would meet, and people often would ask me about how McClellan was able to do that. Well, he was able to do it for a very simple reason. The executive secretary of the NLRB and McClellan were buddies. I'm going to let Tommy take over in a second. In the printing industry, I used to get this because after I left McClellan would often assign me cases around the country for the printing industry. And the newspaper industry would put out every month a labor and personnel relations letter. And in that letter, it would go through all the printing industry. Court decisions, NLRB representational elections, newspaper, contract settlements, so that I would, representing a Printing Pressmen's Local, let's say in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, I remember I have one there, I could go to this every month and find out what the contract negotiations were and what the contract resulted in various parts of the United States. Now, today, of course, you just go into a computer. But in those days, you had to go to this newsletter. And I subscribed to it and got it. And then at the end of the year, they would bind it and send you a bound copy. And it was the most valuable thing because I would go through, when I would represent a newspaper local, I'd find out how much the pressmen were being paid in towns and cities of like and similar populations to which I was involved in the negotiations. Just invaluable tool. It became the reason why the strike continued. And the strike continued for a very simple fact. Remember I said they became economic strikers when they walked out. And for all practical purposes, they walked out on their job. And when they saw people cross the picket line, they saw people take their job. If the strike could have been changed to an unfair labor practice strike, then the union had the right to demand that when the strike concluded, that the employees who had gone out and strike got their jobs back. The only way you can get an unfair labor practice strike, I had one, in Johnson City, Leon Fehrenbach, and textile place. And we were able to get an unfair labor practice and had the strike converted from an economic to an unfair labor practice strike. So that when we settled the contract, the employees who had crossed the picket line, they lost their jobs. And the jobs of those who had gone on strike, they came back into the plant taking their jobs back. It was the 5 unions were unsuccessful in converting it to an unfair labor practice strike. And therefore, the big issue became, if we settle the contract, are we going to let these strikers back in to do their job, the jobs they formerly did? That gives you kind of an overview of the law and why they went on strike. Tommy was a vice president of the Printing Pressmen's Local at a young age. He was a member of the negotiating committee. And he went out and strike. And I'm running, my mouth is dry as a bone. He was one of the strikers and remained a striker. The strike lasted, it's hard to say when it concluded. Legally, it concluded when the printing pressmen and all the 5 unions, 2 years after they went on a strike. Because remember, they had a year that they still had representational rights. You had this special election that occurred almost over a new weekend. The hearings ended like on the prior Monday, and the decision of the board in Washington was on the following Monday. So you had 2 years that way. You added another year to the representational status of the 5 unions. As a practical legal matter, that's when the strike was over, for all practical purposes, because they were not able to get the unfair labor practice posture that they looked for. Now, Tommy's going to talk to you about the actual strike and what happened and his involvement in it. Thank you.
Excuse me for keeping my seat, but I've had surgery recently on several things. But since we're all old folks, I will tell you this: anybody having knee trouble, 4 weeks ago I had the new deal that the ball players have on your knee, and I hadn't had a pain since. That's called replenishing the platelets. They actually take blood out of your arm, put it in a centrifuge, spin it, put the white blood cells back into your knee, and I've been pain-free for 4 weeks. Anybody's interested? Several doctors doing it now. All righty. I think most people can hear me. Let me start before. Okay. Let me start before the strike. I was just out of the Marine Corps and went to the press to work and to the funeral home to work, both places, and was selected to be on the negotiating team and was elected vice president of the union. And back in the 50s, when we started, when we had what they call sweetheart contracts because of Colonel Palmer and Major Berry, which both had deceased, and now we had Walter Smith and Ed Treby and our local teams, and we negotiated a couple of contracts. But in 1960, when we was negotiating, they brought in the Honorable Cliff Fretzley, who was, in my opinion, a union buster. I later had an arbitration case with him in Alcoa, Tennessee, and he accepted me. He said, well, we was on different sides of the press, but I respect him, and so and I ruled kind of a split decision in his favor because he was right. But in 1960 is when they started wanting to start getting rid of the old men. Men had been to work there. Some of them went to work, Buck Slaughter, Brian Isley, some of the old folks went to work at the press room on concrete floors at 10 cents an hour back when they first started. They broke down, their legs just broke down, their feet broke down. They wanted to get rid of them because they could no longer do what they did when they was young folks. So that was my opinion, kind of the beginning of the Kingsport Press Strike. And when Mr. Fritz came in and made some of those comments, I thought right then we probably should have struck in 1960, because I'm going to get old one of these days, and so is everybody. But then in 1963, before we started negotiating in the summer of 62, and we saw what was happening, they'd come up with this new deal. Here's a loaf of bread. You cut it the way you want to cut it. But they never would tell us how much money is in the loaf of bread. So that was the beginning of the Kingsport Press Strike. And so in the Pressmen's Union, we voted twice. They actually offered us a contract, but we came out all 5 unions together, and we wasn't going to cross the bookbinders, the typographical unions, picket lines. So there started the strike. Well, during the strike, it got a little rough, as you know. You can't control 1,900 people, I don't care what happens. The sad part about the strike, in my opinion, is families are still to this day broken over this. Even in our church, we had problems. So you went back to work and you didn't. They wouldn't speak. Some people dropped out of the church and all this. But I know of one family to this day, sister and brother will not speak over the press strike. That's the sad part about it. And the city got involved in the strike too, when we had all the people on the picket line. The city got involved and even called the fire trucks out on us one time. Well, you can't control 1,900 people. Of course, the firemen finally run and left their trucks sitting down there because the strikers had enough people to turn those fire trucks over with. And Eisenbice came in as supposedly a safety director. They found out later, another one of the city's mistakes, he walked the beat in Kansas City. He wasn't no safety director. But that's water over there. I'm not talking about a man because he's dead, but that's true. Then the great law firm, which is, I do a lot of work for them now, was involved. Hunter Smith and Davis, Jack Smith and Ed Norris, fine people, took care of the union stuff. And they had Jack Rolliston, who's no longer here. He's in Chattanooga now. Had Jack Rolliston pretty well side up, and he made the ruling of 2 pickets on each picket line. But during the night, and I now know who did it, didn't know at that time because he went back to work the next morning after he done it. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he threw a tear gas bomb in Jack Rolliston's house down at Ridgefields. And of course, I was with McClellan then at that time. McClellan called me at 2 o'clock in the morning, come and get me. We got to go to the judge's house. We go down there. Jack shows us his chest where the tear gas had burned his chest, you know. And McClellan, with his witty comments, said, well, why didn't you just get a hold of it and throw it back outside? Well, it made the judge mad. But anyway, the moral of this story was, the next morning we had cases coming up on the picket line, different violations, both company and union, coming up before the judge the next morning. The next morning, when he got on the bench to hear the cases, he announced that he was through. He walked out, Chief. We no longer had a judge. I guess he got the message, you know. But there are a lot of things went on that we couldn't control as leaders of the union. You can't, when you got 13 people or 1,300 people on the picket line at one time, you can't control them, you know. We had one case I've got to tell about too. This man is no longer dead. Some of them probably knew him. Sam Justice had the Mountaineer restaurant. Well, Sam was on the picket line. Police was on the picket line. During that big crowds of 13 people, which you can't control, he went to J.C. Penney's and cut a girl's hair. Well, we didn't know that. He kept saying no, and he had 2 witnesses. A policeman said he was on the picket line. Well, we went to Blunteville to try the case in the criminal court, McClellan really argued, I mean, sweat and all, circumstantial evidence. We cleared him. On the way back down the road, I was driving, John was in the front seat, Sam was in the back seat, and Preston Taylor, who was a lawyer here in town, helped us. And John said, well, I'm really glad we won this case, because I just, circumstantial evidence is still questionable, Sam went up back of John's head and said, zzz. John turned around, you cut her hair, didn't you? That was some of the things that went on that we did not approve of, but it happens when you've got that many people out on strike. We also, Bruce didn't mention this too, we went to New York one time to negotiate with the Theodore Keel. You've probably heard of him, was a big mediator in New York City, and we didn't do any good there. And then another main thing that happened in the press strike was the vacation lawsuit. See, everybody was employees on the first Friday in March was entitled to their vacation suit. Well, the big firm Hunter, Smith & Davis questioned that. We went to federal court, lost it before Judge Anise in the federal court, but went to the Court of Appeals and then back hearing in Cincinnati and won it. That was over $500,000. Another big lawsuit that happened in the case too was a lot of our ladies was expecting children, during the strike. So the insurance company, after we come out on strike, the insurance company wouldn't pay. So we took that to court, and the court held in the favor was if she was pregnant on March 11th, 1963, the insurance companies had to pay for the deliveries of the babies. Why did I strike the Kingsport Press Strike? I had a good job. I was a freshman, even though Bruce said I got my card on the picket line. But why I struck was the way they was trying to do the old men, get rid of them, and they thought the only place you could work, and they preached this in their heads back in those days, the only place you could work was the Kingsport Press or Tennessee Eastman. I never will forget on Sunday before March 11th, when I walked out with my toolbox, Mr. Francis said, you'll starve to death. Well, I weighed 135 pounds then, now I weigh 275. So I was starved, and I did when I had that case in Alcoa, Tennessee. I told him too, I said, Mr. Fritzley, I've gained a lot of weight. I don't know how it comes since I starved, But that's why I struck, was because they didn't obey. Some people can say they were fortunate. I can say I was fortunate because with my training and the schooling that John McClellan and Bruce helped me with, I became a federal mediator and arbitrator, proved by every organization in the nation. I've now had cases in Texas and Huntsville, Alabama, do a lot of work for TVA. So I can say that I've benefited, and through my training and the strike and all that, I've been able to do well financially, and been able to even give some of the money back to the city of Kingsport, and bought the property at the churches to give because of the atheists questioning our Christmas thing. So I can say I benefited, and a lot of people did benefit by the strike. And the strike was not, some people said the strike was what ended the Kingsport Press. It did not. Digital and these computers and copying machines is what ended the Kingsport Press. Because you can do just as much now on a copying machine as you could on the big presses. Questions?
Wait.
Why did the union ask for 5% and 80% and 80% increases? An 80% increase in 10 years will double the person's salary and will double the cost for the union, for the company. So why do they ask for such, that's a large raise.
No, it was normally what we've been getting
It's still
over
a
the
large
years.
raise.
Yeah, but you got to throw that figure out. You always, in mediation, you always throw a big figure out so you can get them to come back with a low figure.
Okay,
Then you
that
meet
was-
in the middle usually.
I got you.
Yeah, we wasn't etched on 8%.
You didn't count on getting that.
No, but see, after we asked for what we did, then they presented the loaf of bread. That was Fritzley's. Here's a loaf of bread, but he wouldn't say how much money's in it. You cut it the way you want to cut it.
So he put the unions in the position of bargaining against each other.
Yeah.
And that is a no-no.
Right.
And so it would never have worked.
But in mediation and contract, and I do a lot of it now, even in our, you always ask for more than you're gonna get, even in the divorce. Divorce mediation is mandatory now. They always ask for everything, you know.
I guess you're
Either
pretty good
side.
at buying a car.
Huh?
You're pretty good at purchasing a car.
Yeah.
Yes.
Many years ago, when I was a lot younger, there was a strike. I'm not sure if it was this one or another one that got, I mean, downright nasty.
No, that was Blue Ridge Glass. They had a murder out there. Blue Ridge
I mean,
Glass.
They was dynamite and
Yeah.
shooting and.
Blue Ridge Glass.
Was that before this strike?
Yeah, oh yeah, long before.
Did
Yes.
this one get that nasty?
No. I mean, they had some egg on and painting cars, and the machinist, I gotta tell you this is funny. The machinist, anybody in the military been in the military? Okay, you know what a mortar was.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you drop your shell in and it goes off. Well, the machinist came up with a reverse mortar to throw the nails into the parking lots to cause flat tires. And it was this spring-loaded, just made this like a motor, or a mortar, but they fill up with the nails and then it was spring-loaded and it'd throw them out. They was so good they could put them in a parking place when a car moved.
And only 20 of them went out on strike out of 44.
What were the wages of these craftspeople at that time?
At that time, well, I was a four-color pressman, I was making $3.85 an hour at that
year?
time,
What was the year?
in 1963, which was good money.
Yeah, it was.
Like I say, I didn't strike for money. I struck because of the way they was wanting to do the old folks.
Someone else? All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate, Tommy and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Bruce and Tommy, we really appreciate you all coming, and we've been trying to get you here for a long time, and we finally did, and we appreciate it very much. So.